All right. I tend to do all the lectures in PowerPoint because I like to use a lot of maps and whatnot. We want to start off with really as far back as we can go, just talking generally about what humans were doing before the rise of the giant civilizations that we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester. So we'll start way early, going all the way back to like the formation of the Earth, which scientists today estimated around 4.5 billion years ago. So formation of the Earth's core, somewhere around there, billions and billions of years ago, which is like an unthinkable amount of time for most of us. So the vast majority of Earth's history for billions of years does not have any people involved. You don't even get dinosaurs until way over here on the scale. So that's pretty late. And dinosaurs were something like 60 or 70 million years ago. The first humans, as we would think of them today, only appear in the world at about 1 million BCE, which is about 1 million years before year zero. Does that make sense? BCE is kind of the new term that historians like to use. They used to use BC. You've heard of that one before, right? But about 20 years ago, historians and scientists started claiming that BC is too closely tied to just one religion. So they stopped using BC and AD. So in the textbooks, you'll see BCE, which means the same thing. They just call it before a common era. So the numbers are all the same up to year zero. Does that make sense? And after year zero, they call it CE instead of AD. That's the only difference. Question?
What common era are they referring to? Like
after year zero. So this year would be 2016 CE. Does that make sense? Instead of 2016 AD. The numbers are all the same. They just changed the label.
So it's still the birth of Christ. It's just they don't call it by that.
They don't want to call it that because it's too attached to one religion. And when you're talking about all of world history, it's hard to apply that religion's interpretation at time to other people. So they tried to be kind of more scientific and say common era. Does that make sense? So you'll see BCE and CE in the textbook. And most documentaries that are fairly recent, they don't use BC and AD anymore. So that's what that means. So the first humans that scientists today recognize as like, fully evolved kind of people-ish people are about 1 million years before zero. Does that make sense? That's a lot of time. Because we've only had 2,000 years since zero, right? And we've seen a lot of changes in the past 2,000 years. Does that make sense? So 1 million years is a gigantic amount of time. And most humans from about 1 million years before zero up until about 10,000 years before zero lived kind of like, as you would think, kind of like caveman style. They were what we call the Paleolithic Age, which directly translates to the term old stone, like old stone technology. The Paleolithic humans seem to have lived mostly as hunter-gatherer societies, which means they do not make their own food. They don't live in cities. They don't have farms. They are wandering tribes of people who chase animal herds. They'll hunt the animals that are local to their area and pick the food off of trees or whatever that is growing in their area until they exhaust the food supply of that place and they have to move on to another place. Does that make sense? So they hunt and they gather the food until there's no food left in that area, then they go somewhere else. They don't build permanent settlements. They're not really in control of their food supply. They're just taking advantage of whatever food just happens to be where they are. Does that make sense? So that goes on for the vast majority of human history. The only things that they really accomplish in this million or so years is they learn to control fire. They learn to make campfires, basically, and think about like starting cooking their food and that kind of stuff, and use fire as a source of heat and light. and they develop language. We have archaeological evidence that shows that they're starting with the creation of written language, which means that they probably had a spoken language. So they're developing ways of communicating with each other. They start making weapons based out of stone tools. So they start carving little arrowheads and whatnot, spear tips out of stone and wood sticks and whatnot. But they're not dealing with, they're not pushing technology to higher and higher levels very quickly. Technology changes very slowly over thousands of years. Does that make sense? And again, these people are not living in permanent settlements. The big change will start to hit around 10,000 BCE. Some of the best archaeological evidence we have for what these people are doing is actually when some of them went and lived in caves in certain areas, and they started drawing things on the walls of their caves. So we call this Paleolithic cave art. We don't exactly know what it means, because they didn't seem to write down much of their language as kind of an explanation for what all this stuff means. So there's a lot of scholars that study these cave drawings and try to figure out what they meant and who wrote them and when and all these kinds of things. The general interpretation is that they realized that humans and animals are closely connected to each other because humans rely on animals for food and all kinds of resources, and that humans are very connected to the natural world. These people seem to have understood that, if a flood hits and destroys the food supply, then they might all die, either in the flood itself or as a result of starvation if they can't find more food. So they understood that any natural phenomenon that could turn catastrophic could wipe them out. So they seem to be interested in nature almost as a religious thing in itself. They come to worship nature and natural phenomena, and they often feared floods and lightning and thunderstorms and whatnot, almost as gods in themselves, because they realize that their survival is completely based on how well nature runs, the natural kind of cycles, the seasons. Does that make sense? And we know that they were keeping track of the moon cycle and the sunset cycle and all kinds of things. So they were keeping track of weather patterns. These were smart people, even though they didn't have the technology that we have today. Is that clear? But early on, they're showing an interest in how did they get there? Is there some kind of supernatural power that directs all these natural phenomena? What is the meaning of life? What are humans around to do? Or are they around to do anything? Or is it just all chaos? So they seem interested in those kinds of questions from a very, very early point. But the big change hits at around 10,000 or so BCE. This is when archaeologists tell us that they find evidence of the first cities, or the first villages built for permanence. So around 10,000 BCE, and it's different according to which civilization you're studying. Some pop up thousands of years later, but 10,000 BCE seems to be the real dividing line. The first major long-term settlement that we have found is actually in northern India, along the Indus River. We believe that's the first point where people came together and they set up long-term settlements. They start making basically what we today think of as farms. Agriculture. They somehow or other realized that it's much safer and convenient for the long term to gather animals together and kind of pen them up and build fencing or something to keep them from wandering all over the place, and raise animals within those areas for long-term food supply, rather than just hunting whatever animals are in their area. Does that make sense? They try to capture them and breed them. And they start trying to figure out how to bring water to those animals and also to bring water into the ground, and plant consistent crops that they notice are growing in that area, especially in the spring and summertime. So they're developing farms on a small scale. And the places that start doing this become very prosperous. They have more food than they really need because they're planning for the long term. Does that make sense? And when they start getting more food, that means that more people come to their village because that's where the food is. I mean, people generally tend to move, even today. They go to prosperous places. So whenever you get a kind of poor or impoverished group next to a wealthy group, you'll get people leaving that poor area and going to the wealthy place, sometimes in dire circumstances, in desperation. And that's happened all throughout human history. At this point, it's happening because they're producing their own food. Does that make sense? They're controlling nature to a certain extent. And again, it happens in northern India first. They also start developing higher levels of technology, better stone weapons and tools and whatnot. And the idea generally seems to spread from there. So questions about this? Neolithic just means new stone. So it's the new level of stone technology. So the textbooks will call it the Neolithic Age, starting around 10,000 BCE and spreading far and wide. Another thing that Neolithic groups do is generally create pottery, which is a massive leap forward in their technology. Pottery is useful for all kinds of things, and some examples are up here. Number one, it's easier to move food around from a farm and bring it to other workers in your civilization. It's easy to sell food by moving it around. Instead of, if you ever, gathered a bunch of popcorn in your hands or something and tried to make it into the room to watch a movie, inevitably something falls out of your hand, right? Does that make sense? So if you build a big pot and maybe put a lid over it, it's easier to move grains of food. Does that make sense? It's also easier to store the food to keep animals or the weather out from, destroying it. So they become masters at storing food for the long term, as long as it'll keep, as long as it won't rot. And also, same thing with water. You can move water a lot easier than just cupping it in your hands and watching it leak through. You make a pot, you can move large amounts of water. So you can take water from a river over to a farm and irrigate the crops. Does it make sense? And it's also easy for cooking. People back then did the same thing that we do today. They take a pot of water and put it over a flame, wait for it to boil. Because it makes the food easier to eat, softer to eat, easier to digest, and also, we now know today, eliminates a lot of bacteria and disease from the food. So it makes the food healthier. Or, I guess, not as sickening as it otherwise would be. Does that make sense? So pottery is a massive leap forward in technology. And all the major civilizations eventually developed pottery. And here's a map of the, at least a few of the major civilizations that we're going to talk about through the semester. The Neolithic Revolution, we now believe, happened first in northern India along the Indus River. Why the Indus River? We believe because it's a natural water supply. The river comes down from some of the giant mountains of the world today, the kind of Hindu Kush mountains in the Himalayan mountain range. So it's a massive amount of snow melting each spring, which means the river overruns its banks and deposits fresh water into the soil around the river in the valley, which makes that soil very easy to farm because it's rejuvenated every year. Does that make sense? So it's a great place to start building farms. And so farming and city building took off in the Indus River Valley, we now know first. You quickly get, the Indus River Valley is around the year 10,000 BCE or so. Quickly after that, you'll get other towns doing many of the same things in what we call today Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Basically the same region. It's a great farming area. So you get a bunch of towns around there. You'll get other towns in northern India along the Ganges. Let's see, Mesopotamia starts at around, I think it's 8,000 BCE or so. China gets going, completely isolated. We think that the Chinese never really had much contact with the early Indians or Mesopotamians because it's too far away and there's these gigantic mountains in between. So we think Chinese civilization gets going along their own, the Yellow River system, probably around 7,000 BCE or so. And then Egypt gets going, I think it's around the same point, around 7,000 BCE or so, along their own river system, the Nile. So you've gone 1,000,000 years, give or take, of humans wandering around. And then suddenly, within about 2,000 or 3,000 years, you get all these different civilizations suddenly building farms and towns, and eventually cities along river systems. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary, right? This is like a decisive turning point moment in all of human history. And historians ask them, it's one of the giant historical questions in all of human history. Why then? And some historians argue that some of the early Indians actually started kind of traveling around and trading, and eventually went to Mesopotamia, and they're the ones that started Mesopotamia, and then kind of becomes an offshoot civilization. But that doesn't happen with China. China seems to just kind of pop up on its own. And there's also one on this map that, or is not on this map. And where is that? Does anyone know? Any guesses?
Africa.
Asia.
Well, this is Asia. This is the start of Asian civilization. The start of African civilization we largely believe to be Egypt. Who else isn't on this map? Who's excluded?
Oh, America.
Yeah, the Americas. The Native American tribes, largely we now think around kind of southern Mexico and Guatemala on today's map. We call them the American civilizations. And they get going somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BCE. So a little bit later, but they're completely isolated from all this, right? That's thousands of years after China started. And they're separated by oceans. But they start doing the same thing within a few thousand years. But when you put that within a context of 1,000,000 years of human history, it's about the same point, about the same time. So it's extraordinary that this would just suddenly be popping up all over the place. And historians are still trying to figure out why. Does it make sense? So if you ever want to be a historian and research that question, I mean, they've been doing work on this and trying to figure it out for many, many decades now. But this is a good map of the Neolithic Revolution from Egypt to China, at least. So most of our semester is going to be focused on talking about these. All right? Questions about that at all? Nope? Good? All right. All right. Well, in the first half, we talked about this already, culture and civilization. So it's the exact same quote from the textbook that we went over in the first half. Still make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And for many decades, many historians generally ask themselves, not just why did this Neolithic revolution hit in so many places at virtually the same kind of moment within a 1,000,000-year history, but how did it proceed? How did it start and get going? And for a long time, there was a lot of different discussions, a lot of different theories about how these cities get built. Basically about the early to mid-1990s, one theory started gaining more acceptance amongst historians and archaeologists and whatnot than the others, and we call this game theory. Game theory it sounds complex when you go through like the steps of it, but it's really a fairly simple idea. it's like you have a bunch of groups, say on the map, in northern India. It's not like people only live near the river. People lived all over the place chasing animals and whatnot. But the city gets built here. Why them? Game theory says that it's kind of like, you guys ever play Monopoly, the game Monopoly? You start out with, I don't know if you're a big group of people, like 5 or 6 people, right? And you all start out with the same amount of money. You start out in the same place, and you start to play the game. And who tends to win in Monopoly?
Whoever gets Park Place and Boardwalk.
Well, there's the luck of landing on those. There's luck involved, right? You're rolling dice, but you're also making decisions.
Yeah.
So if you go through the first steps of the board and you use all your money to buy the cheap properties, guess what happens if you land on Park Place? You can't buy it. You got no money, right? Does that make sense? So there's luck of where you land and when, but it's also kind of strategic about buying what you really think is going to help you win. But, I mean, when me and my brothers played Monopoly when I was young, who's the personality that tends to win? Is it the nice person that helps everyone else?
No, it's the cutthroat.
It's the cutthroat one that wants your money and doesn't want to make deals, doesn't want to be nice, and maybe cheats a little bit too.
That's all right.
Yeah. That's how you win Monopoly. And the same thing is true of game theory. Oops. If there's many different groups out there and they're all kind of competing for the same resources, it's the group that maybe has a little bit better resources to start with, like living next to a really good river system. And it's the group that uses those resources in the most brutal, cutthroat way to dominate others that tends to win and becomes a big, powerful empire.
Take over.
Say again?
I said we take over them.
Yep. So game theory says that the group that just happens to live next to a good river system, they can grow food easier than any other group. Because the river overruns its banks usually about once a year in the springtime when the snow's all melting, the river, flows wildly. And when that fresh river water goes into the soil, it rejuvenates the soil. So the soil is really good for planting. Does that make sense? Whereas your neighbors, maybe further out in the desert, they can't get access to that water. They try to grow food in the desert and it doesn't really work out very well. Or if it works, they don't get as much food out of their plants as you get living next to the river. Does that make sense? And if you're one of these cutthroat, brutal people, you don't share your water with them or your food with them. But game theory says that the places that are next to the river system, since they can grow food easier than anyone else, they don't need all their people to be farmers. The food just grows really fast and easily. So if you have like 1,000 people in your society, maybe you need 900 of them to be farmers to grow enough food for everybody, but you've got like 100 people left over. So you send them into what we call specialized labor type jobs. They learn trades. They learn how to build houses, or how to cook food the best, or store food, or they learn how to make weapons, or fight with weapons. So they build up higher levels of technology faster. Does that make sense? Then the group out in the desert, they have 1,000 people in their society, but every single one of them needs to be a farmer because they're having a real hard time growing enough food. Does that make sense? So just that little advantage, just a few more people to go into specialized labor, launches your society ahead in technology. And when you invest in that technology to build weapons, and you have better weapons than your neighbors, guess what? No guesses?
Be able to do more?
Huh?
Be able to do more?
Do more? Well, what do? You can do more, but
Take what they have.
take what they have. You conquer them. Specialized workers often become fighters, warriors. or they figure out how to build more efficient buildings, or they figure out how to build up religions that get a higher level of dedication and sacrifice from their people, and they're willing to go out and risk their lives and fight. Not always just to get more food, but maybe for religious ideas. So game theory says that if your society is good at taking advantage of its natural kind of benefits of being in that place, then they get more powerful faster than their neighbors. They conquer their neighbors and establish empires. Does that make sense? And all the big empires that you'll find in the textbook and the ones that we're going to talk about this semester, we're going to go back to this game theory over and over and over again as the starting point for like Egypt or Rome or Greece or whatever it is. Does that make sense? Or China or the Aztec and the Maya. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It seems to be the same process repeating over and over again. And that's why game theory has become so important for historians as an explanation of why these groups rose to power instead of other groups. But again, just like Monopoly, there's a lot of luck involved. I mean, you could be taking real good advantage of your resources, but if a hurricane hits and wipes you out, you're done. Or if you have a really good king who's really smart and knows how to lead and take control and conquer places, that could be a great advantage. But what happens if the king gets sick and dies? Luck intervenes sometimes. Does that make sense? So it's not all, this group was most strategic or most cutthroat or smartest in how to use their resources. Sometimes it's just luck. And that's one of the exciting things about being alive in the world, no? You can make all the plans you want in the world, but life intervenes sometimes. Sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. It makes life exciting. No? Or you guys just want to be able to plan out every single day of the rest of your life? I'll leave that up to you. All right. One city was called Katohayuk. This is one of the ancient cities, and this is a computer rendering that archaeologists have built based on what they've uncovered underground, the foundations of the old buildings. The buildings are gone today, but the foundations, like the little bit of wall or something sticking up from the ground, has been excavated. And so they built this computer model of what the buildings probably look like in this town. And you can see it's pretty extensive. We're talking 2 or 3-story buildings. This group had an innovation of putting the buildings real close to each other so you can travel around on the rooftops and go down ladders into the buildings. So these are smart people. And this is just one example of the way that one society chose to build up its city. And I'll go back to the map. Let's see. Katohayuk is way up here in the Anatolian Peninsula, so that's way far away from the other major civilizations. So that shows you the idea is traveling far and wide of building these cities. People are moving around pretty consistently, especially by around the year 4000 BC or so, and especially amongst India, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. They all will start having contact with each other around 4000 BCE. But as they start building cities, the very fact that they can build large buildings implies other things to us, or any kind of large structure, really, including irrigation ditches to bring water from the river out into the farmlands. The very fact that big projects like that are being built implies to historians that there's a certain amount of what we call social stratification, which means there's a group in charge, there's an elite, and then there's someone below everybody else, the general workforce. Because it's not like people just randomly decide to build these giant buildings or irrigation canals. They're planned. which means that some kind of elite group is in power, and they're educated and know enough about technology to figure out how to build something and plan it out. Basically, like architects drawing up blueprints today. They know enough about mathematics and force and even gravity to try to figure out how to build long-term buildings that'll last a long time. And they have access to a lot of workers. I mean, just like today, the architects who design a building, they're not usually the one that shows up at the construction site and puts all the bricks together. Does that make sense? They're the educated elite. They plan the thing out. They show up to the construction site and watch the thing be built according to the plan, but they're not the manual laborer doing the real physical work of it. Does it make sense? So they have access through one way or another of a big labor supply, a lot of workers. Either through paying those workers like a daily wage to do the physical work of building the thing, or they may be enslaved. But one way or another, the labor is organized, planned, and directed by the elite, those in control. Which tells us that there was an elite to do the planning in the first place. So there's probably a government that's on the rise, or feels powerful and secure enough or wealthy enough to either pay workers or force them to do the work under threat. And that this society has to be wealthy enough, prosperous enough to get the resources together to actually build the thing. Because one thing that archaeologists notice about a lot of these buildings is that they're made out of materials, bricks or mortar or whatever, that isn't always from their local area. Sometimes the rock comes from far away, which means that they must have been prosperous enough to pay traders to go out and get the rock from like 10 or 12 miles away, move it to the construction site. Does it make sense? And sometimes it's extremely difficult, which means they had to have access to technology. They're building wheeled carts to put rock on and push the cart to the construction site, or a boat that's strong enough to move down the river with maybe thousands of pounds of rock on it. So these are extremely smart people, and governments seem to be investing in scientific technology to accomplish their goals. And this also implies to us that they had a written language to plan out this amount of work, and to buy resources from far away, and to pay people, and to they're setting up accounting methods. Does it make sense? To pay the workers and make sure that they have enough money to continue the project. So just the fact that large buildings exist, historians and archaeologists and whatnot glean all of these ideas just from the fact that building is there. And if you ever read major ancient historical sources, like the big scholarly works, you would be shocked at the amount of information they can get just from a little building foundation somewhere. They learn all kinds of stuff. How thick the walls are tells us how tall the building might have been. Or if a building had really thick walls, they're probably afraid of being attacked, right? So they want to build the walls really high to fight off invaders. If the walls are real thin, it means they're probably not really worried about being attacked, or they're not worried about the weather outside. Does that make sense? So all that stuff just from the little foundations of a wall that they dug up somewhere in the world. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Questions about that at all? All right. And they're still finding new excavations all over the world. A major leap forward in technology hits at around the year 3100 BCE. And this is the invention of bronze technology. Basically, the metals that these civilizations were using before this point were largely copper and tin. Those were the hardest metals that they were finding. So they made their weapons out of it. They, built ships with it and all kinds of things. Until probably accidentally one day, a metal worker accidentally dropped some tin and copper down into the same pot, and it got melted together. And that's what created bronze. So bronze is a kind of smelting together of copper and tin, the two naturally occurring metals. Does that make sense? And bronze is way stronger than copper or tin individually. So the government that figures that out quickly starts building their swords and their shields and other weapons out of bronze. Because they know if they make an army and their soldiers are outfitted with bronze swords, they go attack an enemy with a tin shield, and what happens?
Cut through the shield.
Cuts right through the shield, and what do you do after that? You kill the fighter. So the groups that developed bronze technology and kind of scaled it up real quick, they started conquering huge empires very quickly, just because they have better weapons than the enemy. Does that make sense? And you'll see that over and over and over again in human history. Whichever group has the newest wave of military technology generally dominates their area and controls others. And that's still true today. This largely starts to hit in Mesopotamia first. Mesopotamia is a later term, or it's a Greek term actually, that the Greeks used when they conquered this area and renamed it a Greek word. They called it Mesopotamia. It means between the two rivers, basically. The Mesopotamians exist thousands of years before the Greeks come along and conquer them. So the Mesopotamians call themselves something different for basically their whole history, so the Greeks come to town. And the Mesopotamians basically define themselves not as Mesopotamians, but as people who live in one of the different cities. And this is a closer map of Mesopotamia. So the two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. And there's a whole bunch of cities that pop up in this area. This is just a map of the major cities. Ur, Lagash, Akkad, and eventually Babylon. Each of these cities started building up higher and higher levels of technology. And the southern cities generally became known as Sumer. And they seem to have the best education system. They start developing a writing system that becomes extremely complex over time called cuneiform. And here's a couple examples of it. It's a counting system, it's a number system, and a written language at the same time. And it eventually, over thousands of years, got built up to the point where they had hundreds and hundreds of different letters, characters, for their language. So it's a very difficult language to learn. And English has what, 26 letters, something like that? 27? And you guys are still taking English classes in college, right? So it's a difficult thing to learn. Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of letters. So it's a giant kind of scholarly language. And in order to understand the full language eventually, you have to go through many levels of education all the way through like the college of their time. So only the super educated could actually read and write the full language. Does that make sense? So they had universities basically where usually the children of wealthy parents went so that the rich kids could learn the language and take over the family business at some point. Because you have to be able to read in order to run a business and write letters and do the accounting. Does that make sense? Or to work for the government, because governments are often based in writing letters and sharing information and having debates. and doing statistical studies and all kinds of things. So the educated elite were really the ones in charge. And here's another example of just how complex this language became. It was a major scholarly language of the time. And even when the Greeks come through and conquer Mesopotamia, 3,000 years later, getting close to year zero, the people in southern Mesopotamia are still using this language. So it has a long-term, long-lasting effect on the area. But just like today, if you don't go to the schools, you can only rise so high in society. You could be a manual laborer or something in Mesopotamia and know how to read and write just like the basic characters. So with like an elementary school education, you could still get jobs, but they weren't the high-paying, powerful positions. Does that make sense? So even in the ancient world, education is a transformative thing. But back then it was mostly a game for the rich. The rich sent their kids to school and tried to keep the laborers out of school to keep them under control. Does that make sense? That's really the way college was for almost all of human history up until about World War II. And that's when the community college system really came into effect to give the children of the working class a chance at pulling themselves out of manual labor and getting into the higher positions. So education has been that kind of source of power for a long, long, long time. The people living in Mesopotamia did not call themselves Mesopotamians. They mostly identified according to the city that they live in. So each city was its own government. Each city was like its own little country. It had its own laws, had its own leaders, had its own social stratification, its own wealthy families, its own territories. But just like countries today, they went to war against each other, trying to conquer each other's farmlands, steal each other's resources, overthrow each other's governments. Does that make sense? So that's where the term city-state comes in. State is a government. So like today, France is a state, Iran is a state, the United States is a state. Does that make sense? And back then, cities were states because they were the central organizing kind of power of society. All right? And mostly the important, at least early cities in Mesopotamia were located around the southern area, Uruk, Lagash. And the northern areas were seen as kind of backward, not really keeping up with all the cultural and technological developments of the South. Does that make sense? And so this guy comes along. Sargon I becomes king of Akkad, one of the northern cities. And we don't know where Sargon came from. There's a legend about Sargon. The legend says that Sargon was born to a mother who was in poverty, who didn't think she could afford to raise the child. So she put the child in a basket, in a little boat, and sent him floating down the river, hoping that he would be adopted by a wealthier family who could afford to raise him. And luckily for the kid, someone does encounter the boat, and they take the baby in and raise the kid. The kid grows up to be kind of what we today call a teenager, late teens, joins the army in Akkad, the city of Akkad, and becomes such a famous fighter on the battlefield for like bravery and leadership and whatnot. He's promoted through the ranks of the army until he becomes like one of the generals of the army. Does that make sense? And at that point, he kind of becomes one of the advisors, the counselors to the royal family, the king of the city. And does so well in that position, by the time he's becoming middle-aged, like into his 40s or so, the king thinks that this guy Sargon is so reliable and so smart, the king makes Sargon heir to the throne. So when the king dies, Sargon becomes the next king of the city. Does that sound like a familiar story to you? Where else have you heard this kind of story?
Is that Moses?
Yeah, it's the Moses story. Historians heavily doubt if this story with Sargon was true. It's a legend. We know that he was king, we just don't know where he came from. Why would he tell this story about himself? Why would it become such a popular legend to the point where it's still remembered today, thousands of years later?
People want to believe the story more than they want to believe the truth.
Well, why do they want to believe this story? What's so great about this
Because it's easier
story?
to follow a king of mythical rise than just a guy who just normally became king.
Yeah. Well, but why do they want to believe it? What's so attractive to this idea to them?
Gives people hope, like the king, like the lower class kid can rise to the top.
Yeah, exactly. It's a powerful story for a politician to say. I started out just like you. And through hard work and dedication, I got all the way up to the highest, most powerful level in our society. Right? And when Obama first ran for president, he talked about this all the time. He still talks about it. I was born into a poor family, single mother, no health insurance, and through hard work, I worked hard in high school, got into good universities, and I kept moving up and up. Started off as a state senator, moved up through the political system, now he's president. And people love this story, right? Because he says, I know what your experience is like. I worked hard just like you did. I came out of poverty just like a lot of you did. So I represent you. I understand your needs. Does that make sense? And Sargon said the same thing. And that's why you hear this same kind of story told over and over and over again from different politicians, different leaders. Because it gets people on their side. It convinces people to support them. It's a powerful political strategy. I don't want to say tool. Because sometimes the story is actually true. Does that make sense? And I'm always entertained by how some politicians, where we know they come from like really rich families or something, they still say, "Oh, I had to work real hard." And I sit there and go, "Yeah, right." You took money from your parents and you went to school, and yeah, you were successful, but you had a very different start from a lot of other people, right? A lot of other opportunities. So I'm always entertained when some of these like really rich kids try to say, "Oh, I had to do all this." I'm like, get the hell out of here. Am I the only one that has that reaction? I just laugh when some politicians try to make that statement. It's like, well, wait a minute. I know your biography. You don't have nearly the struggle that most people have. But there's that. But we know that he becomes king, and he leads Akkad in a series of conquests of basically most of the cities of Mesopotamia, and builds it into what becomes known as the Akkadian Empire. He conquers cities all the way down into the south and launches one of the first giant empires in human history. He basically conquers all of Mesopotamia, one by one, and he does it over many years. So he's a very successful leader. And he didn't just conquer these other cities and just, execute all their people and just annihilate the city and just take their food or something. He made deals with different city leaders, saying that people in power in that city, they can keep their land and their wealth. They're just going to owe allegiance to the king of Akkad instead of the king of Ur or something like that. Does it make sense? And Sargon and his advisors probably were smart enough to understand that if he wanted to make Akkad super efficient, they ran investigations into how each city functioned. And if one city or another had like an especially efficient idea for how to move water around or how to grow certain food or make certain buildings or whatever, mass-produce weapons, then they didn't just like annihilate that idea. They adopted that idea and spread it to the rest of the empire so that all of the rest of the population would use that idea and kind of scale the idea up and make society more efficient, or at least government power more efficient. Does that make sense? So he used the innovations of the many areas he conquered instead of wiping them out, like declaring them evil and different and all that. He realized that they had something to contribute. So the Akkadian Empire was extremely powerful and lasted beyond Sargon's lifetime. As people tend to do, Sargon, got old and died, right? So he was king for a while, and his inheritor seemed to do a little bit less of a good job than he did. So the Akkadian Empire, its height is in Sargon's lifetime. They go into a decline phase where things get a little bit worse and a little bit worse. And eventually the Akkadian Empire collapses. One of his inheritors was named Naram Sin. And the main reason we talk about this guy is on the side of a building, this king had himself portrayed in art to make him look so great and powerful. So this kind of piece shows the king literally walking on the faces of his people, walking on their heads, going up to the sun, which we think was probably one of their gods or their deities or something. But it shows obvious social stratification because the king is so much bigger and stronger than anybody else. And he's literally walking on top of them to get to where he wants to go. But it also shows some artistic problems when you kind of look at the king specifically really close. He's walking sideways, right? But the artist wants to show the king as bigger and stronger, physically in muscle, stronger than anyone else, and he can't really do that when they're walking sideways. Does that make sense? So he has the king with his feet walking sideways, but strangely turned toward the audience to show the muscle, to show how much better he is than everyone else. But the king has to look where he's going, so look at his head is still facing the direction he's walking. So he's it's very strange physical interpretation of a person trying to walk. And they had this special helmet for him, a special crown with these two horns that depicted him as the king. And if he's facing forward and wearing the two-horn crown, you won't be able to say both horns, right? Does that make sense? So they turned the crown on his head sideways, so he's looking straight on, but they kind of flip it so you can see both horns, so you can tell how important he is. So there's 4 levels of shifting his body around to get all the interpretations that they want, even as he's walking up the side of his people. So they understand the power of propaganda because they have images like this all over the place depicting the king as better and stronger to get the allegiance of the people. But they're running into just the artistic problems of how are you going to do this while having him physically doing something. And it's problems that a lot of artists won't really solve for many, many, many years. You'll see similar problems really until about Greece. But that's thousands of years from now. Does that make sense? So Sargon's around, he dies. His inheritors do a steadily worse job at governing than he did, to the point where the Akkadian Empire is weakened and eventually gets attacked. We believe from the northwest. On this map, it says Syria. So these other people, another group of people came in and started attacking the empire. They eventually overthrow the Akkadian Empire and take control of it themselves and build their capital city at Babylon. So the textbooks will call them the Babylonians, largely because we don't know exactly who they were, where they came from, so name them after the place they built. Does that make sense? And the Babylonians will be in charge of this area of Mesopotamia for about 400 years. The most famous of the Babylonian kings is named Hammurabi. Not exactly because of the big things that he did while he was king, or conquering new areas, or any new innovations or anything, but mostly as a result of luck. We found a big stone that has a lot of Babylonian writing on it that appears to be a big chunk of their law code, and it's creatively called the Hammurabian Code. And since it's been translated, historians analyze what it says. And just like analyzing the foundations of old buildings, they glean all kinds of assumptions about Babylonian society from these just little bit of laws that they found. The law code is mostly a crime and punishment kind of code. If you commit this crime, then you'll get this punishment. And just looking at what crimes are emphasized and literally what the thing says, it appears to be a retribution code, which means that the code says that the punishment should fit the crime. Does that make sense? So it's like an eye for an eye kind of deal. If you cut out somebody's eye, then the punishment is that your eye will be cut out. Does that make sense? If you cut off someone's arm, then you lose an arm. Which sounds pretty brutal to us today, but back then was seen as a very kind of liberal law code, that you should only pay an equal amount in punishment as you inflicted on someone else. So it's not like if you cut someone's finger off, then you get executed. Does that make sense? It sets a limit on the punishment. Is that clear? All right. Let's see. And it's obviously meant to deter crime, because if you're caught and convicted, found guilty, you're going to be punished the same way that you harm somebody. It also shows us that there's a heavy emphasis on social stratification, because with really big crimes, it depends on who you are. If you're a wealthy landowner and you steal a few goats from your neighboring landowner, then you'll just have to pay a fine. If you're a laborer that doesn't own your own land, you're one of the poor people basically, and you steal goats from a landowner, you might get executed. So it's a vastly more dangerous thing to do if you're in one of the lower classes of society. Does that make sense? So that tells us who's in charge of society, right? It's the landowners. And it tells us that they're probably experiencing a lot of theft. Because why make a law for something that's not really a problem? Right? If it's not a problem, you don't make a law for it. So it tells us that the landowners are probably number one in charge, and number two, very worried about the poor people stealing from them. Does that make sense? Which probably means that it was going on, which means it was a fairly unequal society. It was a society where the rich and powerful ruled and everyone else was kind of pushed around. It also talks a lot about property. So property seems to have been one of the most important things in their society. You own land, you own a house or weapons or animals or whatever. So there appeared to be a lot of theft going on, especially the rich people were very worried about this. It also talks about slavery, and it describes slavery in two different ways. Number one is if you took a loan, if you went to a wealthy person and borrowed money from them with the interest rate attached, and you couldn't pay it back, then you would be enslaved to the person that you owed money to. And you would work for them day after day until you had done enough labor equal to the amount of money you owed. And then you would be free. Does that make sense? So it's like paying off your debt through work if you don't have the money. Is that clear? And we know from the Hammurabian Code that some of the interest rates are pretty bad. I mean, some interest rates are talking 30 or 40%, which seems like a conspiracy of the rich to drive poor people or debtors into a debt they couldn't possibly repay, possibly just get free labor from them. Does that make sense? Another form of slavery is basically what we call chattel slavery, where people lose all their rights as humans. Like if you're a debt slave, you still have the right to eat, and you can't be beaten to a certain level. You can't be killed and all kinds of things. A chattel slave is someone that's basically treated like an animal. Usually prisoners of war from a place that you conquered, and you enslaved the men and brought them back to farms or whatever and forced them to work. So they're usually treated pretty miserably and are usually enslaved for life. So their treatment is much, much, much worse, getting much closer to what you think of like slavery in the United States, right? Which becomes one of the most brutal forms of slavery in all of human history. So questions about the Hammurabian Code at all, or why it's important, or what we've learned from it? Nope.
The chattel slavery. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, it's chattel slavery is basically like slaves being treated like animals. You don't really care about their long-term health or anything. You give them just barely enough food to eat and place to sleep at night, and you just work them until they're dead. So yeah, it's basically declaring the slaves to have lost their humanity. Yeah. And all kinds of different societies will get involved with chattel slavery. Even the Greeks will do it eventually, even to themselves. Greeks will do it to other Greeks. But it's usually the most inhumane form of slavery. And going over to the United States, that's the form that we're taught in U.S. history. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Other questions? Nope. All right. And when you're talking about loss of humanity and all this, it can get involved with a lot of racism, obviously. All right. So the Babylonians are around until about the year 1600 BCE or so, and then they get invaded by someone else. We think from the western areas that generally are known as the Hittites. They invade the Babylonian Empire and conquer big chunks of it and establish rule over big parts of Mesopotamia, especially in the 1590s, but they go on for a while. They're mostly successful because the Hittites are using the next wave of metal technology, which is iron. So iron is stronger than bronze, and the Hittites invaded with iron weapons and defeated the bronze-equipped Babylonian armies. So the next level of military technology was successful. And iron will remain the strongest metal for a long, long time. So that'll be one of the highest levels or the highest level of metal technology going into the future. Does anyone know what replaced iron? Steel. Does anyone know when steel started?
In the 20th century, I believe, or 19th century.
Yeah, late 1800s.
Yeah.
So steel's only been around for about 150 years in our own time. So iron has a long, long history of being the strongest metal. All right. Anything you want to talk about with Akkad or Sargon or Mesopotamia in general? Nope. Feeling good about all that? All right. Yep, that's where we're stopped.